She's coming back now. Her breathing is returning. She can feel her own hands. She hears the voices in the room. Christ has risen. Yes, he has risen. On the Feast of Ascension, May 28, 1987, oil began to flow again from the icon of Mary and the Christ child. By 10:30, the marble container was half full. The oil was flowing at the rate of 1 drop per second. The house was filled with people. As usual, the priests were there. They sang songs and prayed the rosary together. Myrna was in the back of the room. Suddenly, oil flowed from her hands. She saw it, but didn't want anyone else to see it. She wanted them to continue the prayers. She tried to go to her room, but she fell down. The priest carried her and put her on the bed. The oil was flowing from her face, her hands. She had pain in her eyes. She entered into an ecstasy. She saw Christ in white. He simply said,
"Love one another and pray with faith."
On July 22, 1987, 500 people prayed at the foot of the statue of Our Lady of Lebanon. During the prayer, oil flowed from Myrna's hands, face, and eyes. She went into another ecstasy. She saw the bright light. It was so bright, it was as if light came from inside her eyes. She could see nothing but the light. She heard a voice. It was a strong voice. It was not like the voice of Christ, but much stronger.
"My daughter, do not be afraid. Through your example, I will educate my generation. Pray, pray, and pray. And if you pray, say, 'Our Father, through the wounds of your beloved Son, deliver us.'"
On July 28, 1987, Myrna was again invited to Lebanon. A procession was organized to honor Our Lady of Soufanieh. Myrna and Nicholas marched with them. As she marched, oil burst out of her face and hands. She felt weak. Nicholas had to hold her. They placed her in a chair and she fell into an ecstasy. She saw a ball of light. The figure of a man was in the light. She could only make out his outline and face. It was Christ. Christ blessed the crowd. She heard no words. Back in Damascus on August 5th, oil again poured out of the icon. There was so much oil, it filled the marble bowl. This is one of the very few times that cameras have filmed the oil dripping from the icon. As you watch, you will see the oil come from between the glass and the paper picture, then build up on the bottom of the plastic frame. This oil came at the rate of 1 drop every 30 seconds and continued all day. The oil from the icon is never consistent, and no one ever knows when it will form or drip. When the bowl is filled, Father Maluli will bring the key and empty the container. Watch the drop at the bottom of the frame. It will build up. It will build up and then drop into the bowl. On the eve of the Feast of Mary's Assumption into Heaven, August 14th, 1987, the little house was packed with people. Myrna's face and hands broke out in oil. Everyone expected something to happen. This is one of the main feast days of the Miracle of Damascus. Myrna's bedroom was filled with people. The patio, the living room, roof, stairs, and even the street were packed with people. The people prayed for Myrna and for a word from God. Oil came from her eyes. They began to burn like fire. She was in great pain. Myrna will no longer try to dig at her eyes. She has come to know that this will only make it worse. However, it takes great restraint on her part to keep from rubbing them. Father Maululi is next to her, consoling her with the knowledge that she's about to see Christ. For when oil comes from inside her eyes, it is a sign she will see Christ. Myrna cries out to Our Lady to help her.
Oh, Mother, take it away. Take it away. God, let your will be done.
Next to Myrna, a man named Garo was placed in a cot. He was diagnosed as brain dead ever since a car accident. He had no brain waves. All medical hope of recovery was gone. During the ecstasy, he was cured. He was cured without Myrna's prayers. His cure was simply by being in the room. He could not even pray for himself. He was cured anyway. Myrna's pain has stopped. She is in ecstasy. Myrna saw a beautiful white light and nothing else for a long time. To her, everything was now calm and peaceful. All thoughts of earth disappeared as she enjoyed the light. Then the figure of a man appeared in the light. He was also made of light, much brighter than the light around him. It was Christ.
My daughter, she is my mother, from whom I was born. He who honors her honors me. He who denies her denies me. And he who asks from her receives, because she is my mother.
Father Maululi waited for her to come back to earth. She woke up and could hear the Father, but she couldn't see anything except the beautiful white light. The doctors continued to examine and to investigate. She must come back from the vision of Christ very slowly, or the contrast between the light and the dark will be too much for her to handle. She can now hear the voices of the people and the prayers, but it is only the beautiful white light that she sees. On September 7, 1987, the eve of the birth of the Virgin Mary, a large number of people were at Nicole's and Myrna's house for prayer. In the patio, oil broke out on her hands and face. She ran away from the people because they were looking at her instead of thinking of the prayers. In her bedroom, oil continued to flow from her hands and face. And then, her eyes. Her eyes were on fire. She couldn't see anything, but she could hear Father Maululi. She asked if he would take the people and the cameras out of the room, but the people would not leave. She was in great pain and wanted to be left alone. She tried to see, but everything was blurred because of the oil in her eyes. Myrna never wanted oil to come upon her. In fact, in the first year, she had prayed that the oil in her hands would stop. She felt as if she was drawing attention away from Christ because the people were always staring at her. By nature, Myrna is a shy and simple girl who would rather be a mother and housewife. The pain continues, and she asks Father Maululi to help her with the oil in her eyes. into ecstasy. Christ reprimanded her for wanting to hide herself.
Mary, aren't you the one that I have chosen? The calm girl whose heart is filled with love and compassion? It has appeared to me that you cannot endure anything for my sake. I shall give you an opportunity to choose, and be certain that if you lose me, you will lose the prayers of those who are around you. And know that the bearing of the cross is inevitable.
God was using her and wanting her to accept that. In fact, God is forcing her to travel, since miracles happen 100 times more often when she travels than when she stays at home in Damascus. Myrna told Father Maluli the message and then began to cry. She felt God was rejecting her. Days later, on the 6th anniversary of the start of the apparitions, Myrna asked Father Maluli to come and pray with her. At 4:30 p.m., oil came from her hands, face, eyes, and wrists. She fell into an ecstasy. Christ appeared to her as pure light. His outline was clear, but his features were not.
My daughter, I value your choosing me, but not in words only. I want you to join my heart to your soft heart, so that our hearts will be united, and thus you will save many suffering souls. Do not hate anyone, otherwise your heart will be so blinded that it will not realize my love. Love everyone just as you have loved me, especially those who hate and spread rumors about you. It is through them that you will earn your glory. Go about your life as a wife, mother, sister. Let neither difficulties nor sufferings burden you, but I want you to defeat it, and I am with you. Otherwise you shall lose my heart. Go and preach to the whole world and tell them without fear that they have to work for unity. It is not so much the fruits of the hands that are considered shameful in a man, but those of his heart. My peace in your heart shall be a blessing to you and to those who have partaken along with you.
The house was filled with people from France, and French doctors examined her. Myrna had resolved to do God's will. He was happy with her. Myrna was happy too. Myrna passed on the message to Father Maluli. The father was happy for her. It warmed his heart to see her so happy. The father read the message of Christ out loud to the people, as he had done so every time for the past 5 years. This is the central patio of her home. No longer her home, but the home of Our Lady and her Son. Father speaks very loudly so that even the people outside might hear what he is saying. Myrna joined the people and listened to the message of Christ. After the message was announced, God gave a sign that he was happy with all of them. The icon began to pour out oil. It continued all day. Myrna and the faithful prayed and thanked God. Nicholas and Myrna were invited to California in 1988. Every home and every church she attended was packed with people. At first, it was only Middle Eastern people who knew about her from their relatives in Syria or Lebanon. But soon, even those who could not speak Arabic came. They could not understand anything that Myrna said, but it did not matter. They came to see the power of God in her, and the power was not in words. Myrna was pregnant for the second time. In California, oil came out of her hands almost everywhere she went. Many copies of the icon poured out oil. Many people were cured. During her California trip, only once during a Mass did oil not come from her hands. On this particular day, at first, the people did not notice the oil on her hand. Later, the crowd went out of control, and Myrna was taken to the church kitchen for safety. In the kitchen of the church, oil is passed out through the window from her hands. Over 1,500 people would receive the oil. If they had been orderly, she would have anointed them herself. She remains docile to whatever happens. Father Paul Romley invited Myrna to St. Nicholas Orthodox Church in Los Angeles. Myrna was close to having a second baby. The baby would later be born in Los Angeles and become an American citizen. Myrna received communion according to the Eastern Orthodox rite. After the Mass, a procession was planned from the altar around the church and back to the altar. Myrna marched with them. Her husband Nicholas is behind her, holding their daughter Miriam. Miriam is the real name of the Mother of God when she was on earth. Miriam is Hebrew for Mary. When Myrna named her, they did not know that. During the Palm Sunday procession around the church, oil came from Myrna's hands. This time the people were polite and orderly. She was taken into the church before the altar. Lines were formed by the ushers so that she could anoint everyone with oil. Because the people were polite this time, everyone would receive the oil from hands that have touched the Virgin Mother of God.
Okay, let me make an announcement before we have too much confusion. Let us come in two lines, and instead of touching her, she'll touch you with the oil.
Please, everybody over
Oil will come from her hands until everyone in this crowd, 1,500 people, is anointed, and then it will disappear.
Before we have too much confusion, just come in two lines. Come in two lines, and she will touch her head with the oil that's secreting from her head.
Some can go this way, some can go right, some can go left.
At St. George's Church in Glendora, Myrna attended another Mass. As usual, the church was overflowing. St. George's is a new church, and this is its largest crowd. Let us hope they continue to come after this day. Myrna is always asked to go on the altar, and she always refuses. First of all, she considers herself to be just one of the people. But more than that, she does not believe that women should even step foot on the holy ground of the altar. She says that this area should be reserved for the priests who represent Christ on earth. The Virgin Mary would not enter the Holy of the Holies at the Temple of Solomon, and so Myrna will not enter either. If she could, she would be in the back of the church. The Very Reverend Paul Romley is introduced.
To have you, welcome, and thank you for having
The witness to what has been taking place, that if I would share that with you. Since 1982, there is a strange phenomenon that's been happening to this young, beautiful lady. 3 times in her life, I believe when the holidays of the church, the Easter, falls on the same calendar between the East and the West, that she goes through what we call stigmata, where she bleeds everywhere that our Lord bled. There is a tape on this, and I think many of you saw the tape. When they planted the crown of thorns on our Lord's head, he was cut here, and so she bled there. When they nailed him to the cross, they used 4 nails, 1 in each hand and 1 in each foot. And those are the places also that she bled. And as our Lord hung on the cross, they pierced his side. And the gospel tells us that blood and water came from the side. And so she bled there as well. When she prays, sometimes oil flows from her hand. The first time that I saw this was when we were in the Palm Sunday procession. And I asked Myrna to walk with me. And we were about halfway through the procession. And she held her hands up for me to see, and her hands were covered with oil. And that day, even though many of us just wiped her whole hand from the oil, yet she had enough oil to anoint over 1,000 people that day. On Good Friday was the second time that I witnessed this phenomenon. After the service, there were a few people that stayed in the church with her. And we went to the side of the cathedral where we have that little side altar. And she placed a little paper icon in the cathedral. She placed it on that side altar and placed both of her hands over the icon. And in a few minutes, the icon was full of oil, as well as her hand. And a third time that I witnessed this was in Dr. Mansour's home, where we were invited to have lunch. And they presented me with an icon of the Theotokos and the Christ child, a beautiful icon that was framed in silver. And we left the icon in the living room as we went into the dining room to have lunch. And as we were coming out after lunch back into the living room, she asked if I wanted her to pray for the icon. And of course, I said, certainly. And just as she went to pick the icon up, you notice that the inside of that framed icon of the Virgin Mary was full of oil again. This is a great phenomenon. Why is this happening to her? God only knows. But I think it's happening to her so that all of us may be a witness to the reality of God. It was Nietzsche who said that God is dead. And a few years ago, many of our priests from all over the country were preaching about what Nietzsche said, God is dead. And we were trying to prove that God was not dead. This man had good reason to say that God is dead because of us. He saw the way we were praying in the churches, and we left the church. When we left the church, we sort of left God in the church. They did not see any miracle or phenomena outside of the church.
She's coming back now. Her breathing is returning. She can feel her own hands. She hears the voices in the room. Christ has risen. Yes, he has risen. On the Feast of Ascension, May 28, 1987, oil began to flow again from the icon of Mary and the Christ child. By 10:30, the marble container was half full. The oil was flowing at the rate of 1 drop per second. The house was filled with people. As usual, the priests were there. They sang songs and prayed the rosary together. Myrna was in the back of the room. Suddenly, oil flowed from her hands. She saw it, but didn't want anyone else to see it. She wanted them to continue the prayers. She tried to go to her room, but she fell down. The priest carried her and put her on the bed. The oil was flowing from her face, her hands. She had pain in her eyes. She entered into an ecstasy. She saw Christ in white. He simply said,
"Love one another and pray with faith."
On July 22, 1987, 500 people prayed at the foot of the statue of Our Lady of Lebanon. During the prayer, oil flowed from Myrna's hands, face, and eyes. She went into another ecstasy. She saw the bright light. It was so bright, it was as if light came from inside her eyes. She could see nothing but the light.